There is a word in Luke 27 that nearly every English translation has rendered one way for 500 years, and that single rendering has built an entire theology the New Testament does not actually teach. The verse says Mary laid her newborn son in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. The word inn is not what Luke wrote. Luke had a perfectly good word for a commercial inn. He uses it in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the wounded man is carried to a panditchain, a proper roadside establishment with an innkeeper and an expense account. He could have used that word in chapter 2. He did not. Instead, he chose kataluma, and the choice was not accidental, because the same author will use the exact same word one more time in the Gospel, at a moment that changes the way the entire birth scene has to be read. Kataluma means a guest room. It is the word a family would use for the spare room in an ordinary house, the space kept apart for visitors, for traveling relatives, for the occasion when the household needed more room than the single living chamber could provide. Every home had the one main room where the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept. Not every home had a kataluma, keeping a room unfilled for most of the year, reserved for someone who had not yet arrived, was a mark of position. And Luke uses the word at the birth of Jesus, and then again near the very end of the Gospel. In the instructions Jesus gives his disciples on the day of the Passover. Go into the city, he says, and a man carrying a jar of water will show you a kataluma, the large furnished upper room, prepared for the meal. No translator renders that second occurrence as the inn, because an inn makes no sense there. The word becomes guest room or upper room the moment it appears in chapter 22. Which raises a problem that has sat inside this text for centuries and very rarely been looked at directly if the word is kataluma in both places, and the translators render it two entirely different ways. Then one of those renderings is not a translation but an interpretation. And that interpretation has become the most famous single line of the birth narrative. The traditional reading has shaped everything that follows: the cold night, the packed village, the door slammed shut. The inn that had no room has been preached for generations as the old world's rejection of its king humanity, so consumed with its own business that it could not find space for God. That image has done real emotional work. It has made people feel the cost of Christmas, the alienation of the incarnate Creator, the scandal of a God unable to secure lodging among his own people. Those feelings have been the engine of 1,000 Christmas sermons. And the image is a fabrication built on a translator's choice. The text does not say the world was full and shut him out. It says the guest room was full, which is a very different statement carrying a very different kind of weight. To feel the difference, you have to know what a first-century Galilean home actually looked like, because nothing about the physical world of this passage survives in the typical Christmas painting. A home in Nazareth or Bethlehem was not the brick cottage of the greeting cards, and it was certainly not the wooden stable of the Nativity set. It was a single rectangular living space, stone walls, packed earth floor, a flat roof. The animals mattered more than the architecture, because a family's wealth was measured in livestock, and the livestock were not housed in a separate building out back. They were brought inside, down onto the lower level of a floor that sloped a step or two below the family's raised sleeping platform. The family lived, ate, conceived children, and died on that upper platform. The animals stood below them, within the same four walls, breathing the same air, filling the same room with their warmth and their smell. And in that lower level, carved into the plaster of the floor or built into the base of the wall, were the mangers, not wooden cradles from a creche set, but the stone or clay troughs from which the animals ate their feed. This is the world the word points toward. When Luke writes that she laid him in a fattening, the feeding trough, he is describing a home, which brings the problem back, and the problem now has a sharper edge. The guest room being full means the family's space for visitors was occupied almost certainly by kin, because everyone was traveling for the census, and no one would have kept a spare room private while relatives slept in the courtyard. There was no commercial establishment with a hard-hearted keeper and a clerk shaking his head at the door. There was a home full of relatives. Mary and Joseph, far from being cast out into the night, were taken in by the household, taken into the single room where the family already was and the animals already stood, because that room was the whole house. Jesus was not born outside the community. He was born inside it, in the center of the family, beside the trough where the livestock ate, in the most intimate domestic space the household possessed. The phrase does not describe a door closed on a stranger. It describes a room already crowded with people, and the newcomers folded into it anyway. This matters directly for anyone who has read themselves into the traditional version of the story for years, anyone who has thought of Christmas as God entering a world that refused him, and has quietly wondered whether their own crowded life, full of obligations and clutter and unanswered messages, has any room left for anything sacred. The traditional reading has taught countless hearts that the world was too busy for God, and that their own busyness is a quiet repetition of that same rejection. But the text undercuts the whole structure. God did not descend into a world that slammed a door in his face. God descended into a home that was already full, and the full home still made space. The space it made was not the reserved guest room, it was the room where daily life actually happened, animals and all. The trough is not a humiliation. It is the location of the ordinary, deliberately chosen. And the ordinary is exactly where the text places him, wrapped in swaddling cloths, the normal dress of any newborn, laid in a feeding trough, the most unremarkable bed in the house. The shepherds are given a sign, and the sign contains no exceptional furniture. A baby wrapped the way every baby was wrapped, lying where the animals ate. Any birth in any peasant home in the region that night would have looked identical. The miracle is not announced in the architecture. It is announced in the ordinariness itself, which pushes the reader toward the uncomfortable recognition that the ordinary is not the place God condescends to visit when nothing better is on offer. The ordinary is the place God chooses first, which returns the question to the kataluma one final time, and this time it carries the weight of the whole gospel. Luke has exactly two uses of that word. The first is the birth, where the guest room is full and the child ends up in the feeding trough. The second is the Last Supper, where the guest room is prepared, a large furnished upper room made ready for the final meal. Between those two rooms, everything happens. The full guest room at the beginning, the prepared guest room at the end. And inside that prepared room sits the grown body of the child born in the crowded house, breaking bread and handing it to the men who will abandon him within hours, then walking out into the night that will end on a cross. The evangelist placed the word in both scenes deliberately. He knew what he was doing. Somewhere between a birth in a house where the guest room was occupied and a supper in a house where the guest room was waiting, the entire movement of the gospel lies concealed, and the reader is left standing at the edge of that gap, forced to ask what exactly happens to the space between one kataluma and the other. The gap between the two katalumata is not measured in years or in distance. It is measured in the eclipse of everything a room is for. The guest room at the birth is full of sleeping relatives, bodies scattered on mats, the warmth of breath and the stir of dreams, a room in which the expected stranger could not be squeezed. The guest room at the supper is empty, swept, furnished, waiting, a room in which the expected stranger will sit down and then walk out into the dark. Between those two rooms lies the whole of the gospel, and the resolution is not that God finally found a place to rest. It is that God stopped trying to be the guest, the one who was laid in a feeding trough because the spare room was taken will, in the prepared room of the last meal, take bread and say that his body is the space through which all others are held. He does not claim the room. He becomes the room. And that movement from seeking a place to be born to offering himself as the place where every other life can come to rest is the exact shape of the Christian life stripped to its bone. Notice what has to happen for that second kataluma to be ready. The text says the disciples will see a man carrying a jar of water, and they will follow him into a house, and he will show them a large furnished upper room. The sign is water carried by a man, a detail that in any first-century village would mark him out, because fetching water was women's work. The evangelist uses the oddity to flag that something liturgical is unfolding, but the real gravity is in the word kataluma once more. It is a furnished room made ready. The verb in the background here is kataluo, the root of kataluma, which means to unyoke, to loosen, to release something that had been carrying a load. The noun for lodging describes the place where beasts are unharnessed and travelers set down their packs. So a kataluma is, by definition, the place of release. At the birth, there was no release available, no unburdening, no settling, no quiet space in which the weary travelers could loosen their straps. At the supper, the room itself announces the act about to happen. Jesus will take bread, give thanks, break it, and give it, saying, "This body is given for you." He will take the cup and call it the new covenant in his blood, and then he will unloose himself from life. The guest room is the place of unyoking, and the unyoking performed there is his own. This is where the mistranslation of Luke 27 does more damage than the sentimental image of a rejected Jesus. The reading that turns kataluma into inn makes the world into a hostile outward place, a crowded commercial thoroughfare where no one had mercy. That reading teaches the believer to spend a lifetime peering outward for the door that might slam shut, waiting for the rejection that never quite arrives, or perhaps arrives so often that it is treated as the very meaning of faithfulness. The text is asking for something else. The world is not an inn. The world is a set of homes, full of people already living their lives, and the guest room is occupied because the guest room is not where life happens. No one can live in the spare room forever. The feeding trough is in the main room, where the family works and eats and breathes, where the lamp is lit and the floor is shared and the animals stir in the night. The birth of Christ does not merely tolerate ordinary life. It takes its place in the room where ordinary life actually is. Which presses the question that has been sitting open since the first half of this passage: what happens in the space between the full guest room and the prepared one? If the text wanted to say that God eventually got what he deserved, it could have ended the gospel at the upper room. The prepared room is offered, the meal is eaten, and the story could close with God finally authorized, finally welcomed, finally given the place of honor. But the story does not close there. The guest room, the place of unyoking, is not the destination. It is the place where Jesus takes off not his sandals but his life. He leaves the room. He walks out to the garden, is betrayed, is arrested, is tried, is dragged outside the wall, and is nailed to a cross under the high sun. The spare room that was full at his birth is full again, full of fear, full of soldiers, full of death. And in that fullness there is, once again, no place for him. He is lifted between heaven and earth, beneath the sign of every empire and every system that protects its own order by making someone else the stranger. He has made the stranger so completely that he no longer has anywhere to lay his head. He must bow his head instead. The Greek for that moment in John is klinos ten kephalon. He leaned his head and gave up his spirit. The verb is klino, the same root that turns up in the word klein, a couch, a place to recline. He had no kataluma at his birth, no spare room, no inn, no place made ready for an arrival. So he made his own body into the couch, into the bed, into the place where the head can finally rest. He bowed into death and released the spirit. And that release is the New Testament word for forgiveness, aphesis, a sending away, a letting go, the same word that opens his public ministry in the synagogue at Nazareth when he reads from Isaiah, "He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives." The root of the guest room is release from a load. The announcement of the gospel is release to the captives. The cross is the moment where the load of the whole world is unyoked, where the animal finally stops straining, where the traveler sets down every pack that was ever carried. God did not find a guest room. God became the place where all burdens are set down. And that means the present-day reader has been asking the wrong question about the Nativity for most of their life. The question is not whether there is room in your heart, your schedule, your year, your well-managed life for Jesus. That question produces the exhausting spiritual project of trying to clear a space, of keeping a guest room swept and ready, of guarding the one clean chamber in the house where God can visit without being contaminated by the mess. The question the text actually raises is whether you have understood that he does not need your guest room. He was never looking for the reserved space. He went straight to the main room, where the family lives and the animals eat, where the floor is dirt and the dishes are still out and the day's work has not been cleaned away. That is the room he sanctifies. And the one who sits in your crowded kitchen, in the clutter of your ordinary hours, is not waiting for you to finish everything and finally make space. He is already lying in the trough of your current life, already breathing the air you breathe, already unyoking you from the burden you have carried so long that you forgot it was there. So the gap between the two katalumata is not a story about God's rejection and eventual triumph. It is a story about what God does with rooms. At the first room, he enters where the birth could be managed. At the second room, he gives away the body that entered there. In between, he spends his entire ministry being the guest room for others, eating with tax collectors, touching lepers, letting a woman wipe his feet with her hair, receiving children who had no status in the house. He is the place of unyoking, the permanent room where the burden falls. And on the cross, he opens that room so wide that no one who comes to it will ever be told again that there is no space. The door of the guest room that was full at his birth has become the door of the guest room that is open for all time. The inn that never existed was never needed. The house was enough because the child lying in the trough was already becoming the room where every exhausted life can finally lie down and rest.